She was zip-tying a leprechaun to the truck's luggage rack when she felt a familiar call from the High Queen's medallion. The leprechaun was writhing in her grip, as anyone would when being forcibly attached to the roof of a 1978 Ford Bronco with nylon cable ties. He would undoubtedly have been swearing up a storm and pronouncing terrible maledictions along with all the writhing, but the third thing she had done after finally catching the little bastard had been to apply some duct tape where it would do the most good. Good old duct tape. Even in fairyland, that stuff had 1,000 uses. The first thing she had done after catching him had been to zip-tie his hands and feet, because obviously. Second had been to punch him in the balls. Partly to subdue him, but mostly because leprechauns could be some rapey little turds. The leprechaun gathered his bound legs and tried to kick her as she went to fasten down his feet. Had the blow landed, it probably would have hurt. The hard little leather shoes missed her nose by maybe an inch. She would have dodged the kick more easily, but that was right when the psychic prod from the medallion started, and that was always distracting. It was a weird, uneasy feeling. Not quite foreboding, but like that in its sense of wrongness. A feeling like just realizing that a critical task has been forgotten. The patient is stitched up, but where are the forceps? Like remembering you left the stove on just as your flight takes off. B.J. Bellamy, unemployed millworker back in Mississippi and all-too-employed keeper of the High Queen's peace here in the Fey realm, thought of that feeling as an "oh shit" of the soul. And it meant that there was more of the High Queen's work to be done. She gave the leprechaun another nut punch to settle him back down. No too hard, mind, as she didn't want to kill the little guy. That would mean getting yelled at by Her Majesty the boss. "Quit that fussing, Ewan," she said. "It's in your best interest to let me take you to Tir na Nog for judgment. You'll get less punishment from the High Queen for running those fake crock of gold swindles than you would from that last batch of dwarves you pulled it on. Or from me if you keep pissing me off." A few more zip ties had him secured enough that he shouldn't come off during the drive even if she scraped the roof on some low-hanging limbs. Which she was not at all tempted to do on purpose. The leprechaun's tape-muffled mouthings in the meantime were probably not a teary-eyed apology for being a thieving dirtbag con artist. Based on experience, they likely involved her body orifices, and a shillelagh, and how both would figure in his eventual revenge. Didn't matter. Leprechaun threats were about as substantive as their promises. And in the odd event that wasn't the case, it wasn't like the little fuckers were bulletproof. Once behind the steering wheel, she took a moment to ponder the medallion's call. It felt, kind of northish. Northwest, maybe. She'd drive northwest and see how that felt. Whether it was the High Queen's magic in the medallion, or the nature of fairyland itself, or whatever, it always seemed that if she drove in the direction of the problem, she would get there approximately when she was needed. Sometimes a little before trouble started, too often just a little too late to stop it, but still in time to punish whoever was responsible. She looked out the window at the peaceful dell where she'd finally run the notorious Ewan the Silver Crimp to ground. The sky was an impossible lustrous blue, a blue that set the skies of Earth to shame. Trees whose leaves were emerald perfection. Flowers and shrubs in colors that would send Monet to the psych ward. Bells were tinkling, the sound of pixies returning to the air after hiding from the commotion. Really, the Fey realm looked so much like the background of a Disney movie, you'd half expect a musical number to break out at any second. Bellamy sighed and put the truck in gear. Disney be damned. She was too big and ugly to be Cinderella. A '78 Bronco made for a crummy pumpkin coach. Her handsome prince had married Tammy Lee Watkins last month. And somewhere out in this idyllic Technicolor dreamland, there was murder going on. If nothing else, at least this round of trouble was obvious. North-northwest, sure enough. Through some more of the flower-carpeted oak woodlands that made up so much of the realm. Into some heavier woods, then down one of those funky elvish forest roads that looked like a deer trail on crack and always seemed to take you way further than the time spent traveling it should have. The first time she'd ever driven one of those, she'd done it with the windows down. Not anymore. There were voices along the darkest parts of those roads, and the things they whispered were not meant for human ears. Then off that road at the first opening and onto an open, rolling heath dotted with scraggly conifers. A tower, not one of those phallic hi-fi ones with all the swoops and frills, but an older, coarser style, stood at the highest swell of ground. And she didn't really need the psychic nudging from the High Queen's medallion to tell her to head for that. The cage hanging from a tall gibbet in front of the place was reason aplenty. She parked the bronco while still some ways off and surveyed the place through binoculars. She always felt vaguely silly using them, what with the eye patch and all, but it was what she had. Someone was in the cage, sure enough. Elf. Probably a hi-fi knight, if the head of golden blonde hair and the chainmail were anything to go by. Couldn't tell if he was dead or alive for a bit, but then he raised his head. Ah, he'd seen her truck and pulled himself up straighter. The tabard he wore over his armor was filthy and spattered with blood, but the symbol sewn on the front was still quite visible, silver oak leek entwined with a golden flame. That was a symbol Bellamy knew quite well. She ought to, since it was hanging from a chain around her neck. She glassed the tower next. It had seen better days, that was for sure. The stonework was crumbling in a few places. There were no flags or pennons flying, and every asshole noble in the Fey realm loved them some pennons. No chimney smoke. No tended lawn or flower beds. No birds. No signs of life. The main door, shut. And surprisingly intact. The immediate area around the tower and gibbet was thick with low, dirty shrubs, with the occasional scattering of iron-red blossoms for color. Easy enough to drive over or through, and not substantial cover, but pretty good concealment for damn near anything capable of lying down. Bellamy heaved a sigh. It was times like this, she wished she had some kind of military or police training. But that was for people who had both eyes, and for her to have kept both eyes past the age of 10 would have also required her to have a different father, so. Anyway, she was sure the Navy SEALs or somebody would have a name for this kind of situation and some kind of set procedure for handling it. She didn't have that knowledge, but she certainly had enough brains to recognize a setup when she was staring right at it. Time to think like a professional, then. If she assumed there was an enemy lying in wait, because what advantages might they have? Numbers, almost certainly. Concealment. A fortified position, as long as they stayed in the tower. Magical bullshit fairy powers, of course. And what advantages did she have? A lever-action Marlin rifle full of .357 jacketed soft points gave the edge in firepower against bows and slings, but numbers would neutralize that. As a human, she had a massive advantage in speed, strength, and durability over almost any Fey ever born, but again, numbers mattered more. She had a steel-bodied four-wheel drive with a big old battering ram of a brush guard on the front. Yeah. She floored it. The Bronco lurched ahead, crashing through the scrub and bouncing over the rolling terrain. 200 yards from the tower and nothing was happening. 150, still nothing. The bushes remained still. No response from the tower. Movement caught her eye. The knight in the cage was gesturing frantically, making go-back motions, then pointing at a spot off toward her right. Moment of truth, did she trust him or not? From what she had seen, he looked kind of cute under the crud and bruises, so, tentative yes. Whether he was legit or not, she did trust Ford Motor Company. She swung the Bronco rightwards and aimed at the patch of crimson-flowered shrubs closest to where the knight was pointing. As she crashed through, the Bronco's wheels rolled over something that crunched underneath. Two other somethings broke from the cover like birds flushed by a spaniel. They were short, about 4 feet. Bigger than a leprechaun, smaller than an elf. She had a fleeting impression of bulbous noses, spindly limbs, and barbed spears before one dove away to her blind side and the other bounced off her bumper and went under the right front wheel. Crunch again. More of the creatures boiled out of concealment up ahead. Spears were waved and a couple were thrown, hitting nothing. Bellamy got a better look at them now. Thin little guys, greenish-tan colored, with big pointy ears and whiskers aplenty. Their clothes were a mishmash of types and conditions, but mostly ragged and too big for them. Hobgoblins, maybe. But hobs were a bunch of peaceful little domestic fae who farmed and brewed and scavenged broken things to mend and trade. Why would a bunch of hobs capture knights and set ambushes? One was right in front of her, winding a sling to launch a rock. The Bronco's brush guard caught him before he could make his cast and down he went. His tasseled red hood dropped out of sight and that's when it clicked. Redcaps. Earth had terrorist murder cults and the Manson family, Fairyland had redcaps. Take a hobgoblin, give him the psyche of Jack the Ripper and the disposition of a broke meth addict, and have him form a tribe with a bunch of like-minded psychopaths. Inbreed for a few generations and boom, redcaps, the Fey realm's most detested bandits and thrill killers. Their custom was to soak their hats in the blood of their victims, giving them their name. Vicious, relentlessly murderous little fuckers. Thankfully rare, though she had an abundance of them at the moment. That actually cheered Bellamy a little. Sure, they were death-crazed murder imps who would gleefully use her innards as a laundry tub, but at least the High Queen wouldn't yell at her for using disproportionate violence against them. Being yelled at by Lonthanelia was just the worst. It was like having a choir of angels sing a hymn about how much you suck. Redcaps were popping up all around, now, the area around the gibbet positively infested with them. Quite a few had slings, but were having a hard time hitting a moving target, even an SUV-sized one. Most had spears, some of which were hurled, to no effect. Curses and imprecations were hurled in greater numbers, to no better effect. She ran down two more, one of them coming dangerously close to getting a good stab in through the front grille before he went down. That was a good way to get a punctured radiator, which would at very best mean walking home. Through Fairyland. Down that deep road with the whispering things. Not no, but hell no. No more taking the spear guy's head on if she could avoid it. A slinger dove away as she went to run him down. She swerved and ran over him anyway, but he'd gone into a deep rut and the left front wheel dropped into it, bringing the Bronco to an abrupt stop. It was times like these that she was glad she always took a potty break before heading off on a mission. The key was to stay on task. Don't focus on the howling, foaming, homicidal maniacs closing in on you. Only a couple were immediate threats. Shift into reverse. Give it some gas. Don't want to spin the tires and get it stuck worse. Draw the backup revolver out of your pocket and give the truck more gas because you still aren't moving out of that rut. A sling stone chipped the passenger window glass. She took that as a message. It meant, hurry the hell up, BJ, although the sender probably meant it as more, I would very much enjoy smashing your head open. She turned to check her blind left side as the truck lurched and tried to jerk itself free. A redcap in what looked like a Sylvan elf's hunting smock was running toward the driver's door, spear in both hands. They might not know what an automobile was or how car doors worked, but they could certainly see through the glass and know where the person driving it was. And with the wheel bottomed out on that side, her window was low enough for the redcap to smash it and start jabbing through. She flung the door open. It hit the tip of the redcap's spear and knocked it aside. Two quick shots from the trusty snub-nose Magnum, fired across her lap, took the redcap's centermass and put him down hard. Sling stones rattled off metal as she yanked the door closed. They were getting way too close now and it was time to floor it, because either the truck came unstuck now or it stopped mattering. The tires spun, spraying dirt. The one in the rut slipped nastily and spun as well, throwing out reddened mud and bits of flesh. A glance in the rearview mirror showed two redcaps had jumped onto the rear bumper and were trying to climb up to the roof. Bellamy had just about resolved herself to shooting at them through the back glass when the tires finally grabbed and the Bronco leaped backwards, free. The redcap boarding party was thrown off and both went under the wheels. Time to head back into the open. Redcaps didn't seem like the types to stay under cover while there was prey and murder around them, so she had probably flushed out all there were, at least in the area near the knight's cage. She would head back out onto surer ground, back toward where she'd parked earlier. If the dozen surviving redcaps chased her, she'd double back and run them down out in the open. If they didn't chase, she'd park out of sling distance, climb up on the roof with her rifle, and play sniper. A .357 lever gun wasn't the most accurate thing at ranges longer than a football field, but she had a couple of dozen shells in her cargo pockets and a few boxes more under the truck seat. At a couple hundred yards, it might take a while, but it was doable. And if they retreated into the tower? She'd burn that bridge when she came to it. Since she had 4 jerry cans of gasoline, a propane torch, and a flare gun in the truck, she could burn quite a few things, come to that. A look behind showed that they were following, after all. Surprisingly quickly for Faye, too. Not nearly as quick as a Ford the 5th 8, of course, but anything fleeing them on foot, including herself, would be hat-die within seconds. Once she had a good enough lead, she started turning around to get on with some more vehicular homicide. She was halfway turned when she noticed the wisp dropping out of the sky. Wisps were a rare example of elvish magic that didn't require direct physical line of sight for the user. In appearance, a wisp was just a glint of light, a vague glimmering in the air that came from nothing at all. BJ was still unclear on whether wisps were actual spells, some sort of tame critter that elves could magically program, or something in between. The important thing was what they did. In a world without cell phones, how did people communicate at long distance? By messenger, mostly. But if you were an elf with magic to spare or money to burn and important things to talk about right freaking now, you sent out a wisp. The wisp came down until it was bobbing in the air just in front of the charging redcaps, who all came to a stop as they reached it. It hovered there for a few seconds, then zipped toward Bellamy's truck. The redcaps stayed where they were, bunched together with weapons lowered and looking surly. That was helpful. She had just gotten the Bronco turned and aimed at them and they still weren't running or splitting up. The wisp came streaking straight at her windshield. It was a little unnerving, but wisps had no physical substance. One could pass right through you and you'd never know it. Stop, please. The voice caused her to stomp the brakes. Partly from surprise and reflex, but mostly because of whose voice it was. A wisp, when used for communication, popped up a little 3D projection of the person who was talking at each end, sort of like a magical Skype call crossed with that Princess Leia hologram from Star Wars. Right now, hanging beside her in the Bronco's cab, was the image of the most beautiful woman B.J. Bellamy had ever seen. Her face was finely molded elven perfection, with eyes the lambent blue of a high-fae paragon, but framed with gently curling hair the color of dark caramel, showing some sylvan ancestry. Her voice was music, an angel's caress to the ears. Her gown was simple white silk, flattering yet unpretentious. In all, a femininity so perfect and sublime as to move a man to worship and a woman to abject surrender. "Hey, boss," Bellamy said, a little unevenly. "I'm, kind of busy here." The image of High Queen Lontanelia held up a hand. "I see that, my good and faithful servant. But it is my wish that the bloodshed end here. The lives of all my subjects are precious to me and it wounds my heart to see them needlessly taken. I have spoken to the misguided ones and they are willing to surrender themselves to you and come before me for judgment. My keeper of the peace, I call upon you to spare these unfortunates and fetch them unharmed to Tir na Nog." While the queen had been speaking, Bellamy's face had fallen into a scowl. She let off the brakes and threw the Bronco back into gear, heading for the cluster of redcaps. Lontanelia smiled. The effect was normally knee-weakening, even to someone used to seeing it and basking in its glory. Bellamy just frowned harder and sped up. "Yes, my dear servant, go and parley with them face to face. Be the face of our royal mercy and—" Yeah. Shut up," Bellamy snapped. The Redcaps were watching the oncoming truck a bit nervously, getting more agitated as it kept increasing speed. "I don't know who the hell you are, but you ain't the queen." She let out a snort. "And taking Redcap bandits alive? If I was that suicidal, I'd just jump off a damn bridge." The Redcaps were just a little late in realizing that the truck wasn't going to stop. They were still bunched together when she plowed through them, scrawny bodies and crimson hats being thrown in every direction. One, a female, was bounced up onto the hood and fetched up against the windshield, head lolling on a broken neck. Bellamy had to suppress the instinct to turn on the wipers and try to sweep the corpse away. How dare you disobey your queen," the projection squawked, sounding less like the real Lontanelia's voice with every word. Plus, Lontanelia never squawked. She had been known to snap, snarl, yell, or denounce, but squawking, that was beneath her. 4 of the Redcaps had avoided getting smashed by the Bronco's charge and were each running a different path to get away to safer and less truck-friendly ground, notably a cluster of boulders downslope a ways. If they got into that, she'd have the devil's own time getting them out. But if she left them there, they'd be behind her when she went to check out the tower. She might not be a professional Redcapologist, but it didn't take one to realize that leaving your back turned on a crew of bloodthirsty murder midgets was a profoundly stupid idea. She skidded the Bronco to a halt, kicked open the door, and slid out with rifle in hand like a one-eyed Steve McQueen with tits. Behind her, the wisp image of whoever was pretending to be Lontanelia was still saying words, but she had no attention for that. The world came down to putting the front sight on each running figure, timing the breath, pulling the trigger, and working the lever. 7 shots was what it took before all 4 of them went down, because hitting a fast-running figure that size at that range was like peeing into a Coke bottle without touching it. She flicked the dead Redcap off the hood and climbed back into the Bronco to find that the wisp image no longer looked like Her Majesty the Boss. This woman was platinum blonde, lovely in the way that most top-caste high-fae were, but with a calculating bitchiness about the eyes. Her borderline indecent scarlet gown probably cost more than the Bellamy home. Lontanelia would have worn it better. "You utter beast," the elf snarled. "Do you know how hard it was to enchant a whole tribe of Redcaps into serving as my minions? Ultra super duper hard." Bellamy shrugged, reloading as she talked. "Who the hell are you and why are you messing around with trying to control Redcaps?" At least magical mind control explained why the captive knight was still alive. The elf sneered disgustedly, like Bellamy had just flicked a booger at her. "You truly are a mere dumb beast, if you do not recognize your mistress's nemesis." She paused, as if expecting the human to slap herself on the forehead and realize, oh, that nemesis. This did not happen and the pause began to grow awkward. "I am Morven Yell," the elf announced. Her expression said, "You'd better know who that is." Bellamy's mouth said nothing of the sort. "Morven Yell the Red, Duchess of Emberpeak, ruler of—" "Oh." Bellamy finally acknowledged. "You're one of those backstabbing highborn chicks that Lontanelia beat out in the power struggle for High Queen." "She did not defeat me." "Are you the High Queen?" "No." "Then you got your ass kicked, lady. A mere setback." Morven Yell waved that notion aside. "Soon enough my plans will bear fruit. Luring a High Queen's knight into my grasp was merely the first step. My brilliant maneuvers shall see each of her servants and allies eliminated one by one, Lontanelia will fall, and the throne of Tir Na Nog will belong to Morven Yell." Bellamy rolled her eye and put the Bronco in gear, heading back to the tower. The psychic prodding from the medallion hadn't lessened at all, so there was more work there. "You think you can outsmart Lontanelia? You couldn't even fool me, and I'm just a dumbass redneck." Morven Yell seemed genuinely hurt by that remark. "I have no idea how you managed to defeat my impersonation spell. My imitation of Lontanelia was absolutely flawless. Until you opened your mouth. That, my faithful servant, business. She only talks like that during official royal court bullshit." Bellamy smiled slightly, to herself. And, yeah, she's a little idealistic, but she's not sappy about it. I mean, it wounds my heart. She shook her head. Jesus Christ, lady. Morvignolle the Red, Duchess of Emberpeak, official nemesis of High Queen Lontanelia, looked like she was about to cry. Yes, well, gloat while you can, she-beast. Just know that you are only falling deeper into my cunning trap. Wisp, end and return. With a flash, the image cut out and the wisp darted through the passenger door, zooming eastwards into the sky and vanishing into the distance. Too bad it hadn't gone to the tower, but it would be too much to ask of freaking fairyland to have the bad guys all stay together for one-stop shopping. Still, Bellamy was glad the wisp call had ended when it did. She was starting to feel embarrassed for the silly bitch. No more redcaps came at her when she pulled up beside the gibbet this time, although the knight in the cage still seemed plenty agitated about something. The cage floor was about 7 feet off the ground. It looked fairly stout, with the door held fast by a bronze padlock the size of her fist. The cage was attached to the gibbet by a hook at the top. She'd been hoping it had been hoisted up there by a chain or something, because then she could just lower the whole cage and open it on the ground. She could chainsaw through the gibbet and drop the whole thing, she supposed, but that might be too hard a fall for the knight, especially if he was injured. Or, she had some bolt cutters stashed somewhere in the back. She could pull up close enough to stand on the tailgate and cut the lock. As she was maneuvering the Bronco into position under the cage, it occurred to her to wonder how a bunch of 4-foot-tall redcaps had managed to stick Sir Elfsalot up there in the first place. Finally in position, she got out and walked to the back of the truck, rifle slung on her shoulder. The knight was pointing at the tower like it was about to charge at them, but there was still no sign of activity there. "You okay up there, bud?" He nodded quickly and kept pointing urgently toward the tower. "Yeah, I know," she said. "I'm still getting the danger vibe from the medallion. What's in there?" For reply, the elf knight started gesturing with his hands like he was polishing an archway or something, then did an angry-faced bodybuilder pose. Whatever the hell that meant. She shook her head. "Sorry, man. I suck at charades. Can't you just tell me?" She had no idea what his gestures in response to that actually meant, but there was a head shake in there and a hand on the mouth, so she took that as a "no, I can't." "All right, I guess it's yes and no then, Sir Magic 8-Ball. Should I go in there after it?" The knight's eyes widened and he shook his head frantically. He pointed at her and made shooing motions. "So, don't go in the tower, run away instead." The elf nodded. "Hey, I'm getting better at this." The Queen's knight was not only cute, he was worried about her. It was kind of sweet. The elf knight rolled his eyes and banged his head on the bars. Then he started making those incomprehensible archway muscleman poses again. Bellamy sighed. "I got no idea what you're trying to say, but I got a job to do and it appears to involve getting you out of there. So how about you keep watch while I find something to chop off that lock?" The knight nodded and turned to watch the tower door while she dropped the tailgate. It was only as she was getting this open that she noticed you and the silver crimp still tied to the luggage rack up top. She'd almost forgotten about having the leprechaun on board. She climbed up to him and pulled the tape off his mouth. "How you doing there, Ewan? Still with us?" "No thanks to you, you great ugly bitch." If nothing else, the leprechaun's lungs were certainly healthy. "For the torments of this hell ride you've put me through, I shall repay tenfold." "Aha. Just like you were gonna repay those dwarven widows for their silver." That was a classic leprechaun scam. All the dwarves would have received was a crock full of gravel with a powerful short-term illusion spell cast on it. Ewan mustered his dignity as best he could while trussed up with zip ties. "Scoff if you will, Peacekeeper Bellamy, but you shall have my curse upon you. You shall know misery." "Yeah, because you can tell I ain't never known that before. Now, do you need anything other than another punch in the balls?" You could almost see the wheels turning in his head. I'm needing to pass water. She shrugged. Go ahead. Not lashed here atop your chariot. I'm gonna have to wash it anyway. There's like a dozen hobs worth of blood on it. Besides, your pants will soak up most of the pee. The leprechaun let out a wail. A cruel and heartless harridan you are, Bellamy. She sighed, remembering why she'd gagged the little bastard in the first place. And you're observant. Now, last chance, do you need anything before I tape your cake hole up again? I crave a bit to drink. Show a poor soul that small mercy, at least. It was amazing how pitiful and unfairly put upon a leprechaun could make himself appear. If the High Queen ever decided to appoint a minister of shameless hypocrisy, she'd do well to pick a leprechaun. Bellamy nodded. All right. I got a jug of water up front. Water, the leprechaun shrieked. 'Tis not enough to torture me, now you'd add poison to my suffering. I meant potheen, you daft cow. Whiskey. The only thing that makes the sight o' your foul face a tolerable thing. He didn't get whiskey, or water either. He did get duct tape. And another punch in the balls. She had just started pulling things out of the truck in her search for those bolt cutters when the knight began frantically stomping the cage floor for her attention. She looked to the tower door and realized why he was so frantic. B.J. Bellamy had gotten used to looming over everybody she met in Fairyland. At 5 feet 11 inches, she was over half a head taller than even the very biggest high fae or wildling elves and was practically Godzilla to little guys like pixies and brownies. Even back in Mississippi, only a handful of guys at the mill were bigger enough than her that she had to look up at them. She was not at all accustomed to being loomed over, herself. The thing that came out the tower door. It fucking loomed. It was every bit of 8 feet tall and over a yard wide across the shoulders. Muscles bulged on long arms the size of an elf knight's torso. An enormous paunch, carpeted with wiry black hair, stuck out in front like the world's worst beer gut. It carried no weapon and wore nothing but a moth-eaten loincloth. Its warty gray face was bearded almost to the eyes, which were themselves an incongruously lively green. Oh, Bellamy said to the elf knight, finally understanding his earlier charades. You meant an ogre. She stepped around the bronco and unslung her rifle. Cocked and shouldered it in the same motion, but kept it at the low ready, not quite aimed at the ogre but not pointed away, either. It tromped toward her, not charging, just a steady, easy stride. Its gaze was fixed on her. From the look of the thing, you would expect it to glare with dull animal ferocity. It did not. Those green eyes were bright, penetrating, self-assured. Maybe a little amused. The look of a banker playing poker against his mortgagers. When the ogre was maybe 40 feet away, she brought the muzzle to bear on its chest. That's close enough, big guy. To her surprise, the ogre stopped, its wide froggy mouth twisted in a slight smile. Then, of all things, it bowed to her. Bowed. Very formally, too, if not all that deeply because of its belly. As you like, Lady Bellamy, the ogre said. By your leave, I would speak with you, ere we attend to our business. Its voice was exactly the kind of gravelly rumble that ought to come from something called ogre, but its enunciation and diction were not. It spoke like a grizzly bear with a Harvard degree. Are you agreeable? I ain't shooting yet, she answered warily. She had seen a few ogres before, but never really been face to face with one. Those few hadn't been much bigger than herself and she had been sure that, in a pinch, she could take one on. High-gravity earth muscles, and all that crap. This monster was a whole different ball game. Just so. The ogre's smile widened and it gave a polite inclination of the head. Permit me to introduce myself. I am Grolock the Bloodswiller, once bearer of many lordly titles among my kind. Now, merely a wanderer, reduced to applying my skills on behalf of those with the wherewithal to hire them. It took Bellamy a moment to parse all that, even after half a year of listening to high fae nobles. So, former big shot turned mercenary? The ogre sighed. Succinct and not inaccurate, if a bit raw. Hired by Duchess What's-Her-Face, I assume. Morvenjel the Red, Grolock corrected with diplomatic precision. A sorceress of considerable power. Really? Bellamy arched her eyebrow. Seems like a nut to me. It is not my place to make such an assessment of my employer. But neither shall I dispute your own analysis. She nodded. That seemed fair enough. I'd introduce myself, but ain't no need, is there? Indeed. Yon leprechaun's caterwauling has served to make your identity familiar for miles about, I should think. But you knew before that, didn't you? The ogre's smile turned into a full-on grin. His mouth was big enough to fit her whole head into and crammed with teeth that looked like something from her Grandpa Bramlet's collection of Indian arrowheads. Guilty as charged, Lady Bellamy. Indeed, I was assigned this vigil with the intent that I should make your acquaintance. Yeah. She raised the rifle a little, bringing the sights nearer her eye. And I guess now that we're acquainted, we can get on down to that business you mentioned. Grolock's smile fell away, though not fully into a frown. If such is your wish. Personally, I had hoped we might converse some while longer. There has been scant opportunity for intelligent discourse since I took station at this forsaken ruin. I ain't shooting yet, she repeated. You want to talk, we'll talk, long as there's some point to it. Bellamy had no objection to carrying out her duties with violence obviously, but if there was a way to get the job done without it, that was preferable. Generally. Morality and ethics aside, it was usually the best way to not get yelled at by the boss lady. If nothing else, she might get some useful information out of the big bastard. Spoken like a true keeper of the peace. Indeed, I do have a purpose in mind to our discussion from which we might both draw some benefit. The ogre rubbed his hands together, the sound like low-grade lumber being sanded. But, with your permission, might I take a spot of refreshment first? It has been some time since my last repast. I'd sooner you stayed where you're at. She gestured meaningfully with the rifle muzzle. Fear not. I shall neither leave your sight, nor approach any nearer than I now stand. He pointed at a ragged bush a few yards to his side. It was one she had driven over, judging by the tire tracks. When she made no reply, he raised his hands and walked carefully to the indicated spot. Keeping his left hand in view, he eased down his right and slowly, making no sudden moves, extracted a dead redcap, held by the foot. The little psycho-hobs were ugly in life, death didn't pretty them up at all. Especially not when death came from a steel-belted radial across the gut. Dripping bits and streamers were dangling from it. I trust you will excuse my discourtesy in dining without you in your company, Lady Bellamy. Grolock seemed genuinely apologetic. Then he brought the redcap corpse up to his mouth and slurped the dangling guts out like spaghetti noodles. She almost shot him based on the sound alone. The ogre wolfed down the redcap's entrails with every sign of relish, leaving smears of gore and filth dribbling down his chin. He regarded the corpse in his hands while he chewed, then grabbed a leg and tore it free like pulling the drumstick off a Thanksgiving turkey. Bellamy wanted to be horrified and disgusted by this display of cannibal barbarism, mostly because that seemed like the way a normal, sane person ought to respond. She wanted to, but it was hard to get too worked up over it. Yes, it was pretty damn gross, especially that gut slurp noise, but beyond that it was difficult to feel much sympathy for a redcap, especially one that was wearing an elvish child's bloody nightshirt as a bandana. Plus, it struck her as kind of hypocritical to get her panties bunched over the ogre eating a dead one, when she'd just massacred like 20 of the bastards with every intention of leaving them out to rot. She expected the ogre to chew the meat off the leg like a person munching on fried chicken, but nope. Grolock just stuck the whole end of the thigh in his mouth and bit it off like the world's nastiest breadstick. The bone crunched noisily, but hindered the bite not at all. This thing had jaws like an industrial shredder. She'd been told that sometimes ogres also had some kind of magic power, but for the life of her she couldn't remember what that was just now. Grolak chewed thoughtfully, then nodded as he swallowed. Palatable. Not nearly as juicy as I had hoped, but tasty in a gamey, starchy sort of way. Ironic that creatures so monomaniacally focused on blood should be so dry. It does leave one wishing for something to wash it down, but there is always later for that. That's mighty optimistic. The ogre grinned at that. It was an entirely revolting sight, even discounting the chunk of intestine stuck in his front teeth. Ah, banter. It goes well with a good meal. Even an adversarial discourse can be enjoyable when a little wit is applied. I cultivated a taste for conversation whilst sojourning amongst the drow. He bit off the redcap's knee and munched it meditatively. In the ogreish lands, eat, kill, and mate are considered sufficient vocabulary for most social interactions. But dark elf society is rather more complex, with a commensurate need for lexical ability. Living there improved both my education and verbal capacity, to the point that, eat, kill, mate, no longer gratified as it once did. He stopped and offered a grotesque wink, gesturing with the remains of the leg. In the conversational sense, I mean. The activities themselves still hold their charm, I assure you. I can see that. Not yet, but perhaps you soon will. There was something distinctly weird in the ogre's tone, almost playful. Was he? No. No way. But that wink. It couldn't be, but. Was he flirting with her? I can banter, too, you see, Grolak went on, sounding pleased with himself. Alas, I have had few opportunities to avail myself of even the mildest badinage since being hired to reinforce the Duchess's minions. Redcaps are not much given to discussion, except upon the topics of headgear and the sanguinary encrimsoning of same. And yon night, while certainly a gentleman of education and refinement equal to my own, the ogre paused to devour the remainder of the redcap's leg, boot and all. Has been enchanted to speechlessness by the Duchess, more's the pity. Enchanted? I figured y'all had cut out his tongue, or something. Hardly. The ogre seemed to find the idea hilarious. My hands lacked the delicacy for such fine operations. And for the redcaps, I doubt that even Duchess Morvignel's magical compulsions could overcome their natural inclinations in the matter of applying blade to flesh. 'Tis most likely that, once they had begun a cut at his mouth, they would not have ended it until it reached his ankles. No, the Duchess desired that the bait for her trap be live, but that he should not be able to give up the game, to the quarry, as it were. Bellamy snorted. If she was worried about that, she should have cast that spell on you. Ooh. A telling point. Grolak chuckled as he pulled one of the redcap's arms off and began nibbling off the fingers. Telling. Heh. I trust you note what I did, there. Unfortunately, she did. Equally unfortunately, about the only things she appreciated less than gigantic cannibal monsters were gigantic cannibal monsters who liked puns. Yeah, that's a knee-slapper. Is there any way to break that mutinous spell on him? The ogre shrugged. As with many minor dweomers, it should be nullifiable via osculatory interaction with an exemplar of feminine chasteness. She sighed. I ain't got but half of them words. You mind repeating that without the thesaurus? The ogre looked like he'd just tasted something more bitter than the redcap's hand he was eating. A kiss, he grumbled, as though using such a common word pained him. The willing kiss of a virgin damsel will typically break that type of enchantment, though you should have little likelihood of finding such an unspoilt maiden in these. He wound down as he caught the sudden reddening of her cheek and sudden shiftiness in her eye. Hold. You cannot mean that you, Lady Bellamy. He grinned again, his widest yet. You have never. Shut up, she snapped. She was torn by conflicting urges. One part of her wanted to crawl away in embarrassment, while another part wanted to shoot Grolak the blood swiller in the face until she ran out of bullets and then crawl away in embarrassment. That ain't none of your damn business, ogre. Indeed it is not. And yet, it segues rather conveniently into that matter of mutual benefit I wish to discuss with you. He took one last bite of Redcap, then tossed the remainder into the bushes. He gave a deep, ringing belch, the scent of which carried all the way to where Bellamy stood, a smell of rot, bile, and something like sweaty feet. That done, he steepled his hands on his belly and continued. You see, Lady Bellamy, there is a certain fact of which I believe you to be currently unaware. I went to school at North Tishomingo, she grunted. So I'm sure there's lots of those. Get to the point. Very well. Grolock swiped a grimy hand through his mane as he marshaled his thoughts. Lady Bellamy, you are, by the standards of my people, a rather desirable female. I wish to breed you. There was a long pause, long enough that they both began to feel a little awkward. I'm sorry, Bellamy said after a bit, carefully. I'll need you to repeat that, because what I think I heard can't be what you actually said. The ogre frowned. It actually looked less threatening than his smiles. Was I insufficiently clear as to my intent? I shall reiterate and elucidate, then. Ahem. The ogre placed his hands on his hips and regarded her through smoky, half-lidded eyes. With your svelte figure and visage so reminiscent of the princesses of my people, you have roused my passions. As such, I extend an invitation to engage in fornication. A carnal liaison. This. He made a circle with the bratwurst-sized fingers of his left hand and pumped his right index finger inside it. In short, that we should indulge in a session of copulation before we conclude our business with your inevitable death at my hands. She was right. He was flirting with her earlier. And now she was being propositioned. For the first time in 32 years of life, a guy was actually hitting on her. Aside from a certain creepy uncle whose hugs always lingered too long and who wasn't allowed within 500 yards of any childcare facility, no guy had ever called her attractive. Certainly not svelte either. The last time she'd hit the scale back in Mississippi, she'd only been a little shy of 200 pounds. Of course, the fact that she was being called attractive by ogre standards kind of took the shine off the compliment. All the shine, actually. It was really more like the opposite of a compliment, if you thought about it. Assuming the ogre meant it sincerely, you could call it flattering, but looked at objectively. Damn. She'd always wondered what it would be like to be wanted by somebody. She had no idea it would be so philosophically confusing. Wait, what was that last part he had said? To offer blunt and vulgar summary, Lady Bellamy, the ogre went on, it would be my honor and pleasure to fuck you hard and well ere I slay you. Yeah, that part. The kill you part. She gestured with the rifle muzzle in a way meant to convey, you're about 2 seconds from being shot in the face. Well, ain't you a charmer? Nothing puts a gal in the mood for loving quite like a death threat, I reckon. You misunderstand. This is not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Your fate is quite sealed at this point. Her answering smirk looked like just another scar among the mass that made up the left side of her face. Oh, I bet I can unseal it pretty good. I urge you to try, then. Grolock spread his arms and motioned toward his chest. Come, I shall make it easy for you. He took a single step forward. As soon as his foot hit the ground, she shot him. The bullet took the ogre dead center of the breastbone. 2 more followed just as quickly as she could work the lever, hitting just under his left nipple, about an inch apart. Grolock looked down at the 3 wounds drizzling blood down his gray hide, matting the hair on his gut, then back up at her. He looked her dead in the eye, pursed his lips, and after a moment declared, ouch. The blood flow was already abating as the ogre continued standing there not dying or clutching himself in agony. As she watched, the wounds began to seal themselves up, baby pink flesh filling in the holes and pushing the impact-deformed .357 slugs out to thump on the ground at his feet. Oh, right. That was the magic some ogres had. Regeneration. Shit. As you see, I am quite resistant to any harm you are capable of inflicting upon my person, Grolok said mildly. Our battle shall thus assuredly result in your demise. She hated to admit it, but the big bastard might just have a point. Thus far, she had been able to resolve her more harrowing cases as keeper of the High Queen's peace mostly via direct application of violence or the threat thereof. Not many of Fairyland's crooks, renegades, or headstrong aristocratic fucktards could go hand-to-hand against a human, especially not one her size. Fists usually got the job done, or her trusty old softball bat. What few serious problems couldn't be beaten into submission could always be shot. When even that wasn't enough, like with the Redcaps, there was always the Bronco. But not for this guy. If she hit something as massive as an 8-foot ogre hard enough to hurt it, big steel brush guard or no, the Ford wasn't likely to be drivable afterwards. Even if that by some miracle took Grolok out for good, it would mean a long walk home. Down that road. You know, we don't have to fight, she said without a great deal of conviction. Talking things out with other people had never been her strong suit. For a woman, being ugly meant you were playing life in hard mode. If an ugly gal didn't have the luck to be born smart enough or rich enough that her looks didn't matter, the next best thing was to have a nice, friendly, engaging personality. From what she had seen with other women, being pretty was better, and probably easier, but charm, warmth, and empathy could go a long way in making up the gap. One of the purchasing clerks at the mill had been like that, a tubby little woman with a face like a pale potato, who everybody just adored, even the damn vendors, because she was just so relentlessly sweet and always seemed to know the right things to say to people. Unfortunately, B.J. Bellamy had opted for a different route through life, trying to make up for her physical unattractiveness with sheer work ethic. She might be hard to look at and harder to talk to, but by God, she got the job done. And that was fine, right up until what was needed to get the job done was the right soft words. The ogre seemed surprised. Are you offering your surrender? No. But I'll be glad to take yours. Grolok blew out a snort that made the blood-caked hair on his gut ripple. Please, Lady Bellamy. There is my professional integrity to think of. Having accepted the Duchess's payment for your elimination, I can hardly be expected to renege without even an attempt at fulfilling my obligations. Resign yourself to the inevitability of your defeat and accept my offer of one final, glorious rutting session ere I take your life, for neither of us leaves this place except by victory over the other. Oh yeah? What's stopping me from just kneecapping you and hauling ass while you regenerate from it? She asked that more from genuine curiosity than any concrete plan to do so. Your own nature as a hero precludes it, Lady Bellamy. That got a laugh out of her. She'd been pretty impressed with the ogre's intellect up until he said that. Shit, I ain't no hero, Chunky. I'm just a gal doing a job. Grolok didn't seem particularly put out by her response. Oh. Is not your job the promulgation of peace and justice within the realm? Well, yeah. But it's just a job. The High Queen's the one who believes in all that stuff, not me. Do you risk your life for beliefs you do not hold? That was an easy one. I risk my life for Lontanelia. I believe in her. The ogre grinned and held up a finger. There we have it. Spoken like a true hero. He waggled the finger at her, cutting off her sputtered response. Please. I have fought and devoured many heroes. I have considerable experience at recognizing the symptoms. So let me speak plainly, should you choose any course other than facing me in combat, I shall immediately slay and eat yon captive royal paladin. Retreat in your chariot, and his blood shall be slaking my thirst ere you reach the forest edge. Her mind raced, sorting through options, leverage, tricks to gain the upper hand that she already knew would never work, bargains she knew would never be accepted. The ogre wasn't stupid. In fact, he wasn't just smart, he was worse than that, he was focused. And not the bull-headed, prideful focus that seemed bred into the bones of too many high-fey noblemen. This bastard was rational, in addition to clever and tough. Hell, he was probably rich and handsome as fuck by ogre standards, too. Totally and completely not fair. She gave no outward sign of the debating and discarding of plans taking place in her brain. To cover her indecision, she indicated the knight with a jerk of her head. He'd want me to leave him. No doubt he would, Grolock smirked. And that will make you fight all the harder to save him. As soon as she heard those words, the utter truth in them hit her. They swept away all the half-formed ploys and half-assed stratagems she'd been groping through. Yeah, she'd never be able to live with herself if she let a guy like that die when there was even a chance she could save him. She would never call herself a hero, not her, but she had some standards. Damn. This ogre knew her better than she knew herself. In addition to being big, smart, and nigh indestructible, the son of a bitch was insightful. She couldn't help it. A laugh, a rare genuine laugh, unmarred by cynicism, welled up and set the High Queen's medallion to bouncing on her chest. Grolock raised a shaggy eyebrow and she explained, "It just hit me, that you're probably more qualified to do my job than I am." Perhaps, he replied. Though I would decline any such appointment due to the necessity of dealing with leprechauns. Their flesh tastes of moldy shamrocks and duplicity. He let out a long sigh. I have enjoyed our discourse, yet my gullet grows parched and the day grows less. Let us resolve, then, shall we proceed directly to the matter of your extermination, or would you prefer to be carnally delighted upon my manhood first? He gestured towards his loincloth. I assure you, my endowment has been favorably compared to siege equipment and is more than adequate to the task. I don't doubt it, she drawled. But, I think I'd like to try something oral. And then she shot him in the mouth. Blood splashed and shattered teeth were blown through the new hole in the ogre's cheek. He shook his head, spraying red in an arc before him, then spat out a wad of his own bloody flesh and bone fragments. He gave her a tattered smile, right front teeth replaced by a blood-drizzling gap, and charged. Bellamy had started moving as soon as she'd fired, backpedaling to keep the range open between them and sliding leftwards to stay in open ground. No point in trying to use the Bronco as an obstacle, the ogre was big enough to just reach across it and pluck her head off. On the other hand, if she kept a little distance and some maneuvering room, she could put her faster human reflexes to good use. Maybe. Hopefully. For being so tall, the ogre's legs were comparatively short and stumpy. Only comparatively, though. In real terms, they were still as long as hers and his stride ate up ground at an alarming rate. Thankfully, he still couldn't corner worth a damn and she was able to sidestep his first rush with room to spare. As he lurched past, she put another round into him, aiming for his kidneys but hitting a bit low. He stumbled as the leg on that side buckled under him, landing on hands and knees. Broken hip, maybe. She'd opened the distance again by the time the ogre got back up onto his good leg, holding the other awkwardly straight. An admirable effort, he grunted, voice sounding much more normal than someone who'd taken a .357 to the chompers ought to. When he turned to face her again, she realized that was because the hole in his face was already sealed over with new pink flesh and a fresh set of fangs, starkly white against the plaque-laden yellow-brown of his old ones, was already filling in the gap in his smile. She kept backing as his awkward, stiff-legged posture began to shift to something more comfortable. Apparently, a hip bone would regenerate just fine, too. It was only a few seconds before Grolock was ready to try again. This time, there was no headlong rush. The ogre's approach was steady and rapid, but by no means a charge. His arms were outstretched for grappling and he kept his balance well back, ready to shift direction at any time. He wasn't particularly nimble, but he was smart enough not to keep playing bull and matador with her. There were treacherous spots in the ground around here, too, ruts and holes to step into and bushes and redcap corpses to trip over. If she kept backing from him for long enough, she would end up doing one of those and then he would rush in and that would be it. In fact, the way he was shifting, he was probably trying to maneuver her into doing just that. Damn. Smart enemies were the worst kind. She'd take a huge, nearly unkillable enemy over a smart one any day of the week. Lucky her. Now she had both. That led her to wonder, if the ogre could regenerate flesh and bones, what about those fancy brains of his? Only one way to find out. She stopped moving back, wanting all the stability she could get for this shot. Hitting a target that was about the size of a watermelon at 50 feet with a rifle was not a difficult shot, on a shooting range. But try doing it while jogging backwards over uneven ground and the watermelon was swaying atop a mountain of muscle that was coming at you with murder by dismemberment in mind. She was aiming for the bridge of his nose, but the bullet plowed through the ogre's left eye instead. Pink-red chunks sprayed out the back of his skull and he stumbled to a halt, swaying on his feet, head down. Bellamy knew better than to just stand there waiting to see what would happen. She'd seen enough movies to pick up on the rule about fighting bad guys that says, if you have to ask if you got him, then you didn't get him. As soon as the shot was made, she'd started moving again, heading to clearer ground over near the tower, stuffing cartridges into the rifle as she went. She didn't get him. It was several seconds before he moved again. One hand came up to the back of his head. His fingers groped through the matted hair there and picked out some stray skull fragments, flicking them into the bushes. Then he raised his head and looked at her, grinning. The eye socket was already knitting itself back together, bulging and writhing as the new eyeball formed inside. Felt that one, he shouted. Sexy female hits hard. Is good fighting. We do more. Wait, what? No time to think about it. He came at her again, not quite as headlong as that first charge, but not as craftily as his second approach either. She put a bullet into his chest as he came on, but that merely made him twist a little and misstep. She dodged his grasp narrowly enough to feel the wind of his hand going by and shot him again, in the back, as he went past. She was trying for a spine shot, but couldn't get on target in time and had to settle for putting a round into his lung. The ogre stumbled to a halt, wheezing slightly from the punctured lung, then spun to face her as she backed away. She took advantage of the pause to try and draw a bead on his head, but he stooped low and she had to adjust. One huge hand swept down into the weeds, then up again. She saw the rock coming too late to do anything about it. Grolock had sidearmed it at her like a baseball. It was the size of her fist and when it hit her in the belly it was like taking a hard punch from a full-grown man. And, yes, she did know exactly what that felt like. For one of the few times in her life, she was glad to be built thick around the middle. She doubled over from the impact, her feet tangled with each other, and over she went, onto her side. It hurt. It hurt a whole damn lot. Probably be peeing blood later. Didn't matter, though. There was fighting to be done and crying like a pussy wouldn't do anything but get her killed. She'd had worse. She'd had worse back when she was just a little bitty thing and couldn't even fight back, and now she was a big old bad-tempered bitch with a rifle in her hands, so there was no reason not to get the fuck up and get back in the fight. Heh. Getting half your face caved in with a fireplace poker sure gave a gal a sense of perspective when it came to coping with pain later in life. The ogre was coming. Aiming upwards while lying on her side was hard. Doing so while trying to catch her breath was harder. But she stayed calm, steadied herself, and didn't rush the shot, because she couldn't afford to miss. He was within spitting distance when she pulled the trigger. This round caught the ogre under the chin, punched upwards, and blew a red slurry out the top of his head. Again he lumbered to a stop, swaying on his feet. His eyes, unfocused, pointed in opposite directions and he croaked out something that was halfway between a word and a cough. Bellamy rolled herself upright, onto her knees. Cocked the rifle and shot him again, under the cheekbone this time. Clambered to her feet and fired again, into the blood-soaked ruins of his face. Backed away as fast as shaky legs would move her and put another one into him, nearly taking off his right ear. He was still just standing there, hands twitching aimlessly, so she put the sights right between his eyes and pulled the trigger again. Click. The marlin was empty. She dug more shells out of her cargo pocket and began fumbling them into the rifle's loading gate, never taking her eye off Grolock. The ogre was still on his feet, but 4.357 magnums to the head had to accomplish something. Right? The aimless fluttering of the ogre's hands stopped and he slowly brought them to his face. He grunted and scrubbed at his eyes and nose, clearing away the blood. He blinked at her and cocked his head a little. She could make out patches of pink where the holes in his face were healing over. As she watched, the half-severed ear knitted itself back onto his head. The ogre's eyes were different, now. Still bright green, but somehow, murkier. Less expressive. There was none of the earlier confident energy to his gaze, just the dull hunger of a brute. He eyed her up and down, then bared his teeth at her. Rayaraf. Mate. Kill. Eat. B.J. Bellamy may have gotten a subadequate education from the Mississippi public school system, but she wasn't stupid. There were a lot of things she didn't know, but there wasn't much she failed to pick up on or put together. Thinking about this magic regeneration crap, assuming you could even apply logic to magic, it made sense that, if the new tissues it generated were just that, new, rather than exact duplicates of the old stuff, then maybe replacement brain bits were too new to have much of anything in them. Or maybe they just had default, ogre stuff, in there. Maybe replacement ogre brains just came preloaded with the basics and not much else. Stuff like mate. Kill. Eat. Yeah, that. The ogre coughed and smacked his lips. Drink, he roared, glancing around. Apparently not finding what he was looking for, he turned his attention back to her. He thrust a filthy sausage-sized finger at her. Mate. Kill. Drink, mate, kill. Then he charged. There was no craft, no strategy in the ogre's rush this time. It was just straight ahead, hands forward, full speed run your ass over Ness. He was fairly quick and she missed the single snapshot she took at him as she dodged, but she was still able to get out of his way just in time. His charge carried him well past her before he could bring himself to a stop next to a mangled redcap corpse. Drink, he laughed as he snatched up the body. A quick twist tore the head off and he held the corpse on high, letting blood drizzle from the neck down into his mouth. There wasn't much, though, and after a few drops he tossed the remains away in disgust. Raka. No drink. Drink. She shot again, clipping him in the shoulder, but all that seemed to do was get his attention. He regarded her through narrowed eyes. Mate, kill, he growled. Then, as though a thought had occurred to him, kill, drink, mate. Whatever that meant to the ogre, it was apparently pretty funny, because he burst out laughing, slapping himself on the belly. Well, she'd wanted a stupider opponent. All she'd had to do was lobotomize the one she already had. Grolock got his laughter under control and shook his finger at her again. Mate, then, kill, he ground out, with the same apparent mental strain Bellamy would have needed to recite the 23rd Psalm in Spanish. Or kill, then mate. He mimed a bite at her, then pumped his hips, which was a sight she could have gone pretty much forever without seeing, before breaking up in laughter again. As alarming as it was having a giant monster who wanted to rape and murder her pondering which order of operations he preferred, what was more alarming was the grammatical improvement. Did that mean his wits were coming back? Was the brain damage thing just temporary? Time for another round of high-impact brain surgery, then. She shot him twice more in the forehead. Once again, he went still for a bit as the slush in his skull began the process of unfucking itself. Okay, time to think. She'd been lead electrician at the mill because she was good at solving problems and getting stuff done. Lonthenelia had picked her to be the High Queen's official bitch-slapping hand because she was good at solving problems and getting stuff done. This was just another thing to be solved and done with. Like any problem, it was just a matter of determining its scope and then figuring how to use the available resources to reduce that scope to zero. So, The problem, magical regeneration powers. She didn't seem able to inflict enough damage on the ogre to keep him from just healing right back from whatever she did. Okay, so she'd failed at overcoming the regeneration part of the equation. What did she know about the magical part of it? Not much. All she had learned about fey magic in the 8 or so months since she'd discovered a certain pointy-eared sorceress bleeding on her porch was that sometimes magic followed the laws of physics, but about as often it just punched physics in the face and stole its lunch money. Lonthanelia always took care of the hocus-pocus end of things. Bellamy remembered asking her once, back when High Queen Lonthanelia was still just Lonnie, the extra-dimensional freeloader, why a sorceress like her who was so bent on being a do-gooder specialized in using fire magic. Why not healing or plant growing or some hippie crap like that? Lonthanelia had explained that it was because fire was a purifying force in magic. It brought forth light to dispel the darkness. It brought forth heat to stave off the coldness of the end. It severed and purged what other magics unnaturally bound and corrupted. And, she had added, sometimes the wicked need a gentle rebuke, and sometimes they need a guiding hand. But sometimes, every now and then, they just need to be set on fire. B.J. Bellamy could do no magic. Had no magic, apart from whatever was in the High Queen's medallion. But fire? Fire she could do. So, gasoline. She had plenty. Pour it on the ogre. How? Blasting his brains all over the landscape only stopped him for a few seconds at a time. That wasn't nearly enough of a window to get close to him, dump gas on him, and get away without ending up as Purina Ogre Chow. Pour it on the ground, wait until he walked into it, and light it. That would only scorch him a little before he got clear. She needed the fuel directly on him. Raph, the ogre roared as his brain came back online. Drink. Or better yet, in him. A plan formed. It wasn't the best, but it might be adequate. One lesson she had learned long before coming to Fairyland was that doing something always gave you more options than doing nothing. An adequate plan done now was better than a great plan done later. Growlock was still getting his bearings as she ran back to the Bronco. She had already pulled one of the jerry cans out while looking for those bolt cutters earlier, so she slung her rifle and grabbed it up. Kill. Mate. Eat. The ogre was heading her way and it sounded like he'd decided on what order to do things in, because he repeated it. She spun off the cap and flung it aside. The jerry can was nearly full and even in the lower gravity was heavy enough to be awkward. She sidestepped as quickly as she could to draw the ogre away from the Bronco. Fuel sloshed out of the can as she stumbled. Fuck it, this would have to be far enough, because Growlock was getting way too close for comfort. She set the can down and ran. As she did, she thrust a finger at the jerry can and yelled, "Drink! Drink! Drink!" The ogre slowed to a stop and regarded the fuel can. He snuffled loudly, nose wrinkling at the smell. "Drink," he repeated, sounding doubtful. But he picked the can up and shook it, hearing it slosh. At that, he grinned like a toddler who'd just found a cookie. "Drink." He threw back his head, held the can over his mouth, and poured. Bellamy took the opportunity to run back to the Bronco. The other component of her almost clever plan was in the emergency kit behind the driver's seat. Wrath. The ogre was spitting and spluttering, trying to get the taste of 87-octane unleaded out of his mouth. "Drink bad. Bad drink." He flung the jerry can aside in disgust. There was still quite a bit of fuel in it, but it looked like he had managed to dump a gallon or two into his mouth and all down his face and belly. His beard and chest hair were soaked with it. She dragged out the emergency bag and ripped it open. Right there in the top was her orange plastic salvation. Growlock shook a cantaloupe-sized fist at her. "Tricky. Eat arms. Then mate. Then kill." And he started stomping toward her to get on with that very process. He was too close for this to work the way she'd planned it. Fuck it, no choice. Do it now, before he can build up speed. Bellamy fired the cheapo Walmart flare gun into his gasoline-soaked face at a range of 15 feet, then threw herself into the Bronco, yanked the door shut, and clawed at the ignition without waiting to see what happened. Fairyland differs from the human world, the poisonous world, as the Fae call it, in several important ways. Most notably for anyone crossing from one to the other, the Fae world's gravity is somewhere around half of Earth's. For another, magic functions much more easily and is a more prevalent natural force on the Fae side of the gates. And, last but not least, the oxygen content of the atmosphere is significantly higher in Fairyland, about 26% compared to Earth's 21%. Fires start very easily in Fairyland. Which is good because, like the High Queen said, sometimes problems just need to be set on fire. The ogre's corpse was still smoldering as Bellamy backed the Bronco, now sporting several new dents, a bent side mirror, and some patches of burnt paint, into place under the knight's cage. She'd kept watch from a distance once Grolock the blood swiller had finally gone to his knees. It had taken until the ogre's head was little more than an ashy skull to get to that point. Not that he'd been attacking that whole time. But his panicked, blinded flailing had been dangerous in itself, as the damaged Bronco could attest. She'd driven around, staying on the move and out of reach as the burning ogre's struggles had subsided and he had slowly wound to a halt, only parking once he had hit the ground. After a bit, he had fallen flat, you couldn't say, on his face, because he didn't have one anymore, and still she had watched, waiting, in case he started up again. She wasn't sure what she would have done about it if he did, but she would have figured something out. That's what Her Majesty the boss paid her for, after all. But he hadn't. He just lay there, belly fat sizzling and popping in the heat. She was glad to be upwind of that. Not only was the ogre not moving, but the oh shit vibes from the medallion had stopped. So, apparently she was just about done here. Good thing, too. Her gut was hurting like a son of a bitch from that rock. It only took a moment to find the bolt cutters and climb onto the tailgate. She took note of the leprechaun still tied to the roof, looking a little singed. She gave him a poke. Yo, Ewan. You still alive? He just glared at her, grunting behind the duct tape gag, and extended a middle finger from each of his bound hands. Yeah, good to know, she said. She raised her hand and the leprechaun's eyes widened as he tried to move some part of himself, any part, to cover his groin. But she just smirked and patted him on the head. The bronze padlock on the cage was no match for hardened steel bolt cutters and was off in about 5 seconds. The knight hung his legs over the edge and she helped him down, her hands on his slim waist, until he stood on the tailgate beside her. She had thought the guy was cute from a distance, but from just a few inches away, whoa. Even the crud and bruises couldn't hide that sculpted jawline, those sparkling indigo eyes, or those cheekbones that you'd need one of those Renaissance Italians to do justice to. Not that most male elves weren't good-looking, but high fae guys tended to be more pretty than handsome. This guy actually looked like he had a Y chromosome. He looked up at her, because he was only about 5 feet 2 inches, after all, and gave her a smile. Upper caste high fae didn't do that very often. Most of them walked around looking like they were wondering who had just farted. This one had a good smile, not all toothy and phony-looking or thin-lipped and forced. An easy smile, a little bit lopsided, unpracticed enough to look genuine. She realized she still had her hands on his waist and jerked them away, a little embarrassed. So, that spell on you, she said, trying to sound casual and failing horribly at it. The mutinous thing. If you want, I could, you know. She cursed herself inside, cursed herself more thoroughly and vehemently than she ever cursed anyone except her father. It was always this way. Every damn time. She could face horrible death and not break a sweat. She could shoot a bastard who needed killing and not feel a thing. But put her in front of a guy she had any kind of interest in, and she turned back into the stammering, self-conscious puddle of goo she'd been before dear old Dad and his fireplace poker had adjusted her view of the world and her place in it. She was a 32-year-old woman, not a fourth grader. The worst a guy could do was say no. Actually, that wasn't true. The worst a guy could do was laugh and say no, in an extremely rude and detailed way. But that was still just words, and even the worst words didn't hurt as much as a fireplace poker to the face, right? So, why couldn't she act like a grown-ass woman when it came to the mushy stuff? The elf knight was still looking up at her, still smiling, but looking just a little puzzled. Probably wondering why the keeper of the High Queen's peace was blushing like a freaking idiot. Probably trying not to laugh at her. Who the hell could blame him? At least he could look at her. That's more than a lot of guys could manage. Well, she'd had one guy who was pretty enthusiastic about her looks. Wanted her, even. All she'd had to do was say yes. He was right over there, burning to ash. Hell, she actually kind of understood it now. How she felt when the ogre was propositioning her. That must be how guys felt when she started hinting about. The knight was taking his leather gauntlets off. She couldn't imagine why, unless he intended to slap her with one and challenge her to a duel. She'd met some high-fae nobles who would have done exactly that in response to a rescue that didn't meet their exacting standards. She'd almost prefer it if he did want a fight. At least then she'd be back in her element. There was a stack of wire-thin true silver rings on his left ring finger. She recognized those. High-fae wedding bands. Upper caste elves put on the first one on their wedding day, then added another for every 10 years of marriage. The knight was wearing 3. Well, as far as brush-offs went, that was fairly gentle. Tactful, even. She kind of appreciated that. She was more than a little surprised when he dropped the gauntlets and reached up to cup her cheek. He had good hands, too. Delicate-looking, but toughened from hard work. He arched an eyebrow and puckered his lips slightly. Oh yeah, right, he still needed that mutinous spell broken, married man or not. Kiss from a virgin to break a spell, just a magical technicality. A quick little peck should do the job with a minimum of fuss and awkwardness and... She hadn't actually realized she was bending her head down to him until he suddenly rose up on his toes and kissed her full on the lips. It was a good kiss. A real kiss. Not that she really had anything to compare it to, but it had feeling to it. Not passion. No tongue or anything like that. But not a little peck or a brush of the lips either. A traditional kiss, she supposed. The kind of kiss Prince Charming would use to revive Snow White. Yeah, he was married and nothing would ever come of it, but it was her first kiss and she enjoyed it all the same. It lasted about 4 seconds, felt like 2 hours, and was over way too soon. Ah, he said as they drew apart. That seems to have broken the enchantment. Damn, even his voice was pure hotness. Whoever he was married to had won the freaking lottery. I thank you, Lady Emissary. She was trying to jar her brain enough to come up with the proper polite response to that when he kissed her again, just like the first one. Again, it wasn't passionate or anything. But it was warm, sweet. Sincere, even. Certainly not something she would mind if it were to happen more often. 8 out of 10, would smooch again. Why, though? Before she could even ask, the knight explained, as he released her and stepped back, the first kiss was to break the spell. That one was your reward for saving me. I, get paid by the High Queen, she answered, a little dazedly. Then please consider that the payment of my rescue tax. That was the kind of line she knew how to reply to. I'll have to rescue you more often. Alas, I fear I could not afford it, he said with a wink. My dear wife has hold of my purse strings, and while she is no miser, neither am I permitted to spend too freely. And there it was, B.J. Bellamy's memorable first kiss ever. Received at age 32 from the lips of a very married man, standing on the tailgate of a filthy old truck, surrounded by dead bodies, while being watched by a trussed-up, pissed-off criminal leprechaun. She would treasure it forever. On a desolate heath in the north of the Fey realm, the sun set over the remains of a battlefield. The victors had departed, leaving the field to the scattered bodies of the defeated and the ever-increasing flocks of carrion birds. A grim and vacant tower, crumbling with age, stood sentinel over the scene, while before it hung an empty cage, door ajar, lock broken. Not too far from the cage lay a heap of blackened meat and bone. It remained untouched by the scavengers, for it still reeked of smoke and char, and the fear of fire runs deep in all beasts, even in a land of magic. And in that lump of soot and cinders and flame-withered flesh, a pair of bright green eyes slowly fluttered open. Author's notes: so ends another tale of B.J. Bellamy in Fairyland. This was a huge amount of fun to write, so I will definitely be doing some more. The title of this one was a last-minute choice, but it's grown on me as it seems to work on a couple of levels. The working title was La Bellamy Sans Merci, but I didn't think too many people would get the reference. Big thanks to all the commenters for their feedback, and thank you all for reading.